Robinson Crusoe by Daniel DeFoe. Read aloud by Samantha Dunn. Part 7. But all this while I made no allowance for the dangers of such a condition, and how I might fall into the hands of savages, and perhaps such as I might have reason to think far worse than the lions and tigers of Africa, that if I once came into their power, I should run a hazard more than 1,000 to 1 of being killed, and perhaps of being eaten. For I had heard that the people of the Caribbean coasts were cannibals or man-eaters, and I knew by the latitude that I could not be far off from that shore. That suppose they were not cannibals, yet they might kill me, as many Europeans who have fallen into their hands have been served, even when they had been 10 or 20 together. Much more I, that was but one, and could make little or no defense. All these things, I say, which I ought to have considered well of, and did cast up in my thoughts afterwards, yet took up none of my apprehensions at first, but my head ran mightily upon the thought of getting over to the shore. Now I wished for my boy Shuri, and the long boat with the shoulder of mutton sail, with which I sailed above 1,000 miles on the coast of Africa. But this was in vain. Then I thought I shall go and look at our ship's boat, which, as I have said, was blown up upon the shore a great way in the storm when we were first cast away. She lay almost where she did at first, but not quite, and was turned, by the force of the waves and the winds, almost bottom upward, against a high ridge of beachy rough sand, but no water about her, as before. If I had had hands to have refitted her, and to have launched her into the water, the boat would have done well enough, and I might have gone back into the Brazils, and with her easily enough. But I might have foreseen that I could no more turn her and set her upright upon her bottom than I could remove the island. However, I went to the woods and cut levers and rollers, and brought them to the boat, resolved to try what I could do, suggesting to myself that if I could but turn her down, I might easily repair the damage she had received, and she would be a very good boat, and that I might go to sea in her very easily. I spared no pains, indeed, in this piece of fruitless toil, and spent, I think, 3 or 4 weeks about it. At last, finding it impossible to heave it up with my little strength, I fell to digging away the sand, to undermine it, and so to make it fall down, setting pieces of wood to thrust and guide it right in the fall. But when I had done this, I was unable to stir it up again, or to get under it, much less move it forward towards the water. So I was forced to give over. And yet, though I gave over the hopes of the boat, my desire to venture over for the main increased rather than decreased, as the means for it seemed impossible. This at length put me upon thinking whether it was not possible to make myself a canoe, or periagua, as such the natives of these climates make, even without tools, or, as I might say, without hands, viz., the trunk of a great tree. This I not only thought possible, but easy, and pleased myself extremely with the thoughts of making it, and with my having much more convenience for it than any of the Negroes or Indians, but not at all considering the particular inconveniencies which I lay under more than the Indians did, viz., want of hands to move it, when it was made, into the water, a difficulty much harder for me to surmount than all the consequences of want of tools could be to them. For what it was to me, that when I had chosen a vast tree in the woods, I might with much trouble cut it down, if, after I might be able, with my tools, to hoe and dub the outside into the proper shape of a boat, and burn or cut the inside to make it hollow, so as to make a boat of it. If, after all this, I must leave it there where I found it, and was not able to launch it into the water. One would have thought I could not have had the least reflection upon my mind of my circumstance while I was making this boat, but I should have immediately thought how I should get into the sea. But my thoughts were so intent upon my voyage over the sea in it, that I never once considered how I should get it off the land. and it was really, in its own nature, more easy for me to guide it over 45 miles of sea than about 45 fathoms of land, where it lay, to set it afloat in the water. I went to work upon this boat the most like a fool that ever man who had any of his senses awake. I pleased myself with the design, without determining whether I was ever able to undertake it. Not but that the difficulty of launching my boat came often into my head, but I put a stop to my own inquiries into it by this foolish answer which I gave myself. Let's first make it. I'll warrant I'll find some way or other to get it along when 'tis done. Well, this was a most preposterous method, but the eagerness of my fancy prevailed, and to work I went. I felled a cedar tree. I question much whether Solomon ever had such a one for the building of the temple at Jerusalem. It was 5 feet 10 inches diameter at the lower part next the stump, and 4 feet 11 inches diameter at the end of 22 feet, after which it lessened for a while, and then parted into branches. It was not without infinite labor that I felled this tree. I was 20 days hacking and hewing at it at the bottom. I was 14 more getting the branches and limbs, and the vast spreading head of it cut off, which I hacked and hewed through with axe and hatchet, and inexpressible labor. After this, it cost me a month to shape it and dub it to a proportion, and to something like the bottom of a boat, that it might swim upright as it ought to do. It cost me near 3 months more to clear the inside and work it so as to make an exact boat of it. This I did, indeed, without fire, by more mallet and chisel, and by the dint of hard labor, till I had brought it to be a very handsome perigua, and big enough to have carried 6 or 20 men, and consequently big enough to have carried me and all my cargo. When I had gone through this work, I was extremely delighted with it. The boat was really much bigger than I ever saw a canoe or perigua that was made of one tree in my life. Many a weary stroke it had cost, you may be sure, and there remained nothing but to get it into the water. And had I gotten it into the water, I make no question that I should have begun the maddest voyage, and the most unlikely to be performed, that ever was undertaken. But all my devices to get it into the water failed me, though they cost me infinite labor too. It lay about 100 yards from the water, and not more, but the first inconvenience was, it was uphill towards the creek. Well, to take away this discouragement, I resolved to dig into the surface of the earth, and to make a declivity. This I began, and it cost me a prodigious deal of pains. But who grudges pains that have their deliverance in view? But when this was worked through, and this difficulty managed, it was still much at one, for I could no more stir the canoe than I could the other boat. Then I measured the distance of ground, and resolved to cut a dock or canal to bring the water up to the canoe, seeing as I could not bring the canoe down to the water. Well, I began this work, and when I began to enter into it and to calculate how deep it was to be dug, how broad, how the stuff was to be thrown out, I found that by the number of hands I had, being none but my own, it must have been 10 or 12 years before I should have gone through with it, for the shore lay high, so that at the upper end it must have been at least 20 feet deep. So at length, though with great reluctancy, I gave this attempt over also. This grieved me heartily, and now I saw, though too late, the folly of beginning a work before we count the cost, and before we judge rightly of our own strength to go through with it. In the middle of this work, I finished my 4th year in this place, and kept my anniversary with the same devotion, and with as much comfort as ever before. For, by a constant study and serious application of the Word of God, and by the assistance of His grace, I gained a different knowledge from what I had before. I entertained different notions of things. I looked now upon the world as a thing remote, which I had nothing to do with, no expectation from, and, indeed, no desires about. In a word, I had nothing indeed to do with it, nor was ever like to have. So I thought it looked, as we may perhaps look upon it hereafter, viz., as a place I had lived in, but was come out of it. And well might I say, as Father Abraham to Dives, between me and thee is a great gulf fixed. In the first place, I was removed from all the wickedness of the world here. I had neither the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, or the pride of life. I had nothing to covet, for I had all that I was now capable of enjoying. I was lord of the whole manor, or, if I pleased, I might call myself king or emperor over the whole country which I had possession of. There were no rivals. I had no competitor, none to dispute sovereignty or command with me. I might have raised shiploadings of corn, but I had no use for it, so I let it as little grow as I thought enough for my occasion. I had tortoises or turtles enough, but now and then one was as much as I could put to any use. I had timber enough to build a fleet of ships. I had grapes enough to have made wine, or to have cured into raisins, to have loaded that fleet when they had been built. But all I could make use of was all that was valuable. I had enough to eat, and to supply my wants, and what was all the rest to me? If I killed more flesh than I could eat, the dog must eat it, or the vermin. If I sowed more corn than I could eat, it must be spoiled. The trees I cut down were laying to rot in the ground. I could make no use of them than for fuel, and that I had no occasion for but to dress my food. In a word, the nature and experience of things dictated to me, upon just reflection, that all of the good things of this world are no farther good to us than they are for our use, and that whatever we may heap up indeed to give others, we enjoy just as much as we can use, and no more. The most covetous, gripping miser in the world would have been cured of the vice of covetousness, if he had been in my case, for I possessed infinitely more than I knew what to do with. I had no room for desire, except it was of things which I had not, and they were but trifles, though indeed of great use to me. I had, as I hinted before, a parcel of money, as well gold as silver, about 36 pounds sterling. Alas! There the nasty, sorry, useless stuff lay. I had no manner of business for it, and I often thought with myself that I would have given a handful of it for a gross of tobacco pipes, or for a hand mill to grind my corn. Nay, I would have given it all for 6 penny worth of turnips and carrot seed out of England, or for a handful of peas and beans and the bottle of ink. As it was, I had not the least advantage by it, or benefit from it. But there it lay in a drawer and grew moldy with the damp of the cave in the wet season. And if I had had the drawer full of diamonds, it had been the same case, and they had been of no manner of value to me, because of no use. I had now brought my state of life to be much easier in itself than it was at first, and much easier to my mind, as well as to my body. I frequently sat down to my meat with a thankfulness and admired the hand of God's providence, which had thus spread my table in the wilderness. I learned to look more upon the bright side of my condition, and less upon the dark side, and to consider what I enjoyed rather than what I wanted. And this gave me sometimes with secret comforts that I cannot express them, and which I take notice of here, to put those discontented people in mind of it, who cannot enjoy comfortably what God has given them, because they see and covet something that He has not given them. All our discontents about what we want appeared to me to spring from the want of thankfulness for what we have. Another reflection was of great use to me, and doubtless would be so to any one that should fall into such distress as mine was, and this was, to compare my present condition with what I had first expected it should be, nay, with what it would certainly have been, if in good providence of God had not wonderfully ordered the ship to be cast up nearer to the shore, where I not only could come at her, but could bring what I got out of her to the shore, for my relief and comfort, without which I had wanted for tools to work, weapons for defense, or gunpowder and shot for getting my food. I spent whole hours, I may say whole days, in representing to myself, in the most lively colors, how I must have acted if I had got nothing out of the ship, how I could not have so much as got any food, except fish and turtles, and that as it was long before I found any of them, I must have perished first, that I should have lived, if I had not perished, like a mere savage, that if I had killed a goat or a fowl by any contrivance, I had no way to flay or open them, or part the flesh from the skin and the bowels, or to cut it up, but must gnaw it with my teeth and pull it with my claws like a beast. These reflections made me very sensible of the goodness of Providence to me, and very thankful for my present condition, with all its hardships and misfortunes. And this part also I cannot but recommend to the reflection of those who are apt, in their misery, to say, "Is there any affliction like mine?" Let them consider how much worse the cases of some people are, and their case might have been, if Providence had thought fit. I had another reflection, which assisted me also to comfort my mind with hopes, and this was comparing my present condition with what I had deserved, and had therefore reason to expect from the hand of Providence. I had lived a dreadful life, perfectly destitute of the knowledge and fear of God. I had been well instructed by my father and mother. Neither had they been wanting to me in their early endeavors to infuse a religious awe of God into my mind, a sense of my duty, and of what the nature and end of my being required of me. But alas, falling early into the seafaring life, which of all the lives is the most destitute of the fear of God, though his terrors are always before them, I say, falling early into a seafaring life, and into seafaring company, all that little sense of religion which I had entertained was laughed out of me by my messmates, by a hardened despising of dangers, and the views of death, which grew habitual to me, by my long absence from all manner of opportunities to converse with anything but what was like myself, or to hear anything that was good, or tended towards it. So void was I of everything that was good, or of the least sense of what I was, or was to be, that in the greatest deliverances I enjoyed, such as my escape from Scilly, my being taken up by the Portuguese master of the ship, my being planted so well in the Brazils, my receiving the cargo from England, and the like, I had never once the words, "Thank God," as much as on my mind, or in my mouth, nor in the greatest distress had I so much as a thought to pray to him, or so much as to say, "Lord, have mercy upon me." No, nor to mention the name of God, unless it was to swear by and blaspheme it. I had terrible reflections upon my mind for many months, as I have already observed, on the account of my wicked and hardened life past. And when I looked about me and considered what particular providences had attended me since my coming into this place, and how God had dealt bountifully with me, had not only punished me less than my iniquity had deserved, but had so plentifully provided for me, this gave me great hopes that my repentance was accepted, and that God had yet mercy in store for me. With these reflections, I worked my mind up, not only to resignation to the will of God and the present disposition of my circumstances, but even to a sincere thankfulness for my condition, and that I, who was yet a living man, ought not to complain, seeing I had not the due punishment of my sins, that I enjoyed so many mercies, which I had no reason to have expected in that place, that I ought never more to repine at my condition, but to rejoice and to give daily thanks for that daily bread, which nothing but a crowd of wonders could have brought, that I ought to consider I had been fed even by miracle, even as great as that of feeding Elijah by ravens, nay, by a long series of miracles, and that I could hardly have named a place in the uninhabitable part of the world where I could have been cast more to my advantage, a place where, as I had no society, which was my affliction on one hand, so I found no ravenous beasts, no furious wolves or tigers to threaten my life, no venomous creatures or poisonous, which I might feed on to my hurt, no savages to murder and devour me. In a word, as my life was a life of sorrow one way, so it was a life of mercy another, and I wanted nothing to make it a life of comfort, but to be able to make my sense of God's goodness to me and care over me in this condition be my daily consolation. And after I did make a just improvement of these things, I went away and was no more sad. I had now been here so long that many things which I had brought on shore for my help were either quite gone or very much wasted and near spent. My ink as I observed, had been gone for some time, all but a very little, which I eked out with water, a little upon a little, till it was so pale it scarce left any appearance of black upon the paper. As long as it lasted, I made use of it to minute down the days of the month on which any remarkable thing happened to me. And first, by casting up times past, I remember that there was a strange concurrence of days in the various providences which befell me, and which, if I had been superstitiously inclined to observe days as a fatal or fortunate, I might have had reason to have looked upon with a great deal of curiosity. First, I had observed that the same day that I broke away from my father and my friends and run away to Hull in order to go to sea, the same day afterwards I was taken by the Sallee man of war and made a slave. The same day of the year that I escaped out of the wreck of that ship in Yarmouth Roads, that same day year afterwards I made my escape from Sallee in the boat. The same day of the year I was born on, viz., the 30th of September, that same day I had my life so miraculously saved 26 years after, when I was cast on shore on this island, so that my wicked life and my solitary life began both on a day. The next thing to my inks being wasted was that of my bread. I mean the biscuit, which I brought out of the ship. This I had husbanded to the last degree, allowing myself but one cake of bread a day for above a year, and yet I was quite without bread for near a year before I got any corn of my own, and great reason I had to be thankful that I had any at all, and getting it being, as it had been already observed, next to miraculous. My clothes began to decay too, mightily. As to linen, I had none a good while, except some checkered shirts, which I found in the chests of other seamen, and which I carefully preserved, because many a times I could bear no other clothes on but a shirt, and it was a very great help to me that I had, among all the men's clothes of the ship, almost 3 dozen of shirts. There was also several thick watchcoats of the seamen's, which were left indeed, but they were too hot to wear, and though it is true that the weather was so violent hot that there was no need of clothes, yet I could not go quite naked. No, though I had been inclined to it, which I was not, nor could abide the thoughts of it, though I was all alone. The reason why I could not quite go naked was I could not bear the heat of the sun so well when quite naked as with some clothes on. Nay, the very heat frequently blistered my skin, whereas with a shirt on, the air itself made some motion, and whistling under that shirt was twofold cooler than without it. No more could I ever bring myself to go out in the heat of the sun without a cap or hat. The heat of the sun beating down with such violence as it does in that place would have given me a headache presently, by darting so directly on my head without a cap or hat on, so that I could not bear it, whereas if I put on my hat, it would presently go away. Upon those views I began to consider about putting the few rags I had, which I called clothes, into some order. I had worn out all the waistcoats I had, and my business was now to try if I could not make jackets out of the great watchcoats which I had by me, and with such other materials as I had. So I set to work a tailoring, or rather, indeed, a botching, for I made most piteous work of it. However, I made shift to make me 2 or 3 new waistcoats, which I hoped would serve me a great while. As for breeches or drawers, I made but a very sorry shift, indeed, till afterward. I have mentioned that I have saved the skins of all the creatures that I killed. I mean 4-footed ones, which I had hung them up stretched out with sticks in the sun, by which means some of them were so dry and hard that they were fit for little, but others it seemed were very useful. The first thing I made of these was a great cap for my head, with the hair on the outside, to shoot off the rain, and this I performed so well that after this I made me a suit of clothes wholly of these skins, that is to say, a waistcoat and breeches open at the knees, and both loose, for they were rather wanting to keep me cool than to keep me warm. I must not admit to acknowledge that they were wretchedly made, for if I was a bad carpenter, I was a worse tailor. However, they were such as I made very good shift with, and when I was abroad, if it happened to rain, the hair of my waistcoat and cap being outermost, I had no trouble keeping dry. After this I spent a great deal of time and pains to make me an umbrella, It was indeed a great want of one, and had a great mind to make one. I had seen them made in the Brazils, where they are very useful in the great heats which are there, and I felt the heats every jot as great here, and greater too, being nearer the equinox. Besides, as I was obliged to be much abroad, it was a most useful thing to me, as well for the rains as the heats. I took a world of pains at it, and was a great while before I could make anything likely to hold. Nay, after I thought I had hit the way, I spoiled 2 or 3 before I made one to my mind. But at last I made one that answered indifferently well. The main difficulty I found was to make it to let down. I could make it to spread, but if it did not let down too and draw in, it was not portable for me anyway, but just over my head, which would not do. However, at last, as I said, I made one to answer, and covered it with skins, the hair upwards, so that it cast off the rains, like a penthouse, and kept off the sun so effectually that I could walk out in the hottest of the weather with greater advantage than I could before in the coolest. And when I had no need of it, I could close it and carry it under my arm. Thus I lived mighty comfortably, my mind being entirely composed by resigning to the will of God, and throwing myself wholly upon the disposal of his providence. This made my life better than sociable. For when I began to regret the want of conversation, I would ask myself whether thus conversing mutually with my own thoughts, and, as I hope I may say, with even God himself, by ejaculations, was not better than the utmost enjoyment of human society in the world.